that comes to your head?
Global warming.
Global warming and outdoor. Fantastic. My project involved neither. I guess now we're on the same page. Alright. To actually get on the same page, let's start with the definition of poverty. My project is actually on poverty. To an extent. Kind of. Vaguely. So, what is poverty to you? What would you define poverty as?
Living in a cardboard box.
Low standard of living.
Low standard of living? Alright, essentially, that's what we get. When we look at the definition of poverty defined by the government, there's actually a really infinite definition of it because it's determined every year by the net income of the U.S. So there is no poverty line because it varies year to year, which is kind of interesting. And apparently 15.5% of people between the ages of 25 and 75 find themselves living at least 1 year in poverty in the U.S., which is kind of significant because that's pretty good enough people, I'm not gonna lie. But here's some interesting facts before we start getting on with this. About 46.2 million people in the United States are currently living in poverty. That's 15.1% of the U.S. population. I have a lovely little pie chart here that you might want to take a gander at. And in our local area, we have a 21% rate of people living in poverty, which is significantly higher than the national rating. That's 1/5 of the population. If you were to put that into statistical forms, that would mean if you had a group of 5 friends, 1 out of the 5 is likely statistically to be dealing with poverty or income issues. If you compare poverty in the U.S. from 2000, which is on your right side, you'll notice that the U.S. poverty is significantly lower. When we look at it, you're jumping from about 9.3% to 15.1% in a 12-year span, which is about 2 million people every year that have fallen into poverty since 2000. That's about 67 times the population of Mount Pleasant every year, or about 1/4 of the population of Michigan. Which comes to the big question, is local poverty an easy fix? Alright. After interviewing people, and this is people in poverty, people in our local community, people in our schools, and some people that interact with people in poverty, like people that own organizations like Love, Inc., stuff like that, I found out that the majority of people don't want poverty to exist. I guess that kind of makes sense. But there's not really a lot of willingness to do anything about it. It's kind of like, yeah, it would be cool if it wasn't there, but I really don't want to do anything to solve it. That's kind of a problem because if you have something that's broken and you ignore it, it's not going to fix itself unless it's some sort of, artificially intelligent AI system. It's just not going to happen. Unfortunately, poverty is not an artificially intelligent AI system. So we have to be prepared to help people out. So this is going to be a bit of a jump, but okay, think of the electronics that came out in this past year. All of the electronics. Come on, let's name a few. I want to hear some things that came out. I mean, this is a pretty big category.
iPhone,
Single fire.
Droid,
Fire. Yes,
Razor,
they update like every 2 weeks. Yeah. I mean, okay, there's literally an endless amount of electronics that came out. So I guess if we're going to narrow it down, just to give you a perspective on things, we have 6 major cell phone companies in the United States right now. I mean, give or take, they keep eating each other, monopoly stuff going on. But right now there's about 6. There are 4 million phones that were sold in 2011, but the average phone cost, and this is including smartphones and flip phones, averages around $150. That's about $6 billion spent in cell phones last year. We spent over $41 billion on consumer electronics last year. That's just the electronics branch in the consumer market. That's not the professional market. We spent $41 billion. I mean, I guess that kind of makes sense, but that's a lot of money. I mean, that's legitimately a lot of money. And it's not that it's bad to own things like this tablet or this computer system that's currently running my presentation, but there's a line where there's spending and then there's excessively spending for no apparent reason. And this line is kind of what defines poverty in our local area, which is different than the national poverty issue. My project originally was on local poverty awareness, which wasn't necessarily how to fix poverty, but just making people know that it's there. But through the course of my research and interactions with individuals, that kind of changed quite a bit, actually. But I just wanted to show people how many people, locally this line is affected, which currently about 21% or 1/5 of the population spell Academy, which is pretty significant. But that was kind of lame, and I thought it would be a simple fix, something like you have a fundraiser, you go out, you give people money, they get happy, their lives are better, your life is better, everybody wins. Unfortunately, it wasn't as simple as that either. But my project originally to fix this problem was the TechnoJam. What I wanted to do was create a fundraiser situation where the community could get involved in a manner where they didn't feel like they were benefiting anyone other than themselves, but were actually doing something for the good of our community, because it's really hard to encourage people to actually do something for someone other than yourself. It's very difficult. These are just some posters, some lovely posters that I posted around the school so that people could come to the TechnoJam. Fortunately, Connor didn't. Here's some pictures. This is interesting. I'm DJing over there and DJing over here. I'm wearing an EL jacket. It's electroluminescent wire. This really isn't important, but it's kind of cool. It glows, and not very many people wear clothes that glow, so that's fun. We had about 50 people show up to this event. Oh. Alright. Whatever. So I had about 50 people come. I charged $2 a person, so I generated a net profit of around $100, give or take, which I think it actually was 100 exactly, but whatever. So it was a live DJ'd event by me and kind of one other person, but mostly me. And nothing really significant happened there, but I did mention that the cause, while we were in the building and in the middle of the presentation, was for poverty, or people that had unprivileged living conditions. And the money ended up being donated to a family that lives in the Bradley Trailer Park. Originally, I had intended to actually go out, take the money, and spend it on items that would be necessities for the family. But given how much I actually generated was a little bit under what I was expecting to generate, and given a family that I actually found in the Bradley Trailer Park, they were actually running short of a bill payment that had to be paid within the next day. And they were short $100. I was like, oh, that's convenient. So I just ended up giving them the money. I'm really hoping they used it for the right cause, but you never really know. And the family did wish to remain anonymous. I would talk a little bit more about them individually because they have a pretty interesting history and it really defines what the local poverty situation is. But I'll kind of touch on it in a more generic piece in a few minutes. One of the biggest things I learned during this presentation is that things changed. The biggest one for me during this presentation was the presentation, so it's a little disorganized because I've been throwing things together consistently since I started working on this. What we have in Mount Pleasant is significantly different than the national poverty line, because nationally things like clothing, shelter, and food are actually a problem, and globally definitely even more so, but nationally this is a problem. However, in Mount Pleasant, that's not really the majority of the issue. There's low-income housing available locally, which is dependent on the amount of income you get in, which if you don't get income through various government projects and whatever bridge cards they may have found along the way, you can get money to sustain a decent life. But the problem is that people are still in poverty, which is kind of funny. And as far as food's concerned, I mean, that's more on the local side, but food. Also, we have about roughly two, maybe three food pantries in Mount Pleasant. They actually waste food every day because there isn't enough people in Mount Pleasant that care to collect food. There actually is wasted food. It's, kind of ironic if you've seen Horizon and Luke Eppel's presentation about wasting food. Kind of touches on that. But I mean, that's one of the things, that we have food available, it's just we don't have enough people that can take the food. So food isn't really a problem either, which is kind of funny. So it's like, okay, so nothing's really wrong, but there's still something wrong. What's the problem? Well, come to find out, also through interviews and other such mannerisms, the problem is education of budget management. What does that mean, budget management? Well, it really doesn't mean anything other than what I just said. Just being able to manage your budget. It's a problem. But it becomes more of a local social problem than it does they put themselves in this situation. At some cases, and it's actually a pretty good amount of the cases, what people spend their money on is not really up to them, even though it is their choice, physically, to spend money on things. Through addictions, whether it be drugs or alcoholism or whatever you end up doing, it's not really, it's more of a compelled buying habit, but it'll deplete your income relatively quickly, especially if you don't have a job and you're depending on the government's programs and you have a family of 4 people. Your income can disappear pretty quickly and you're going to be living, who knows where, probably on the streets. But this is an interesting thing. I was reading around and I found an article on something called a luxury gap. This is a theory of what is happening to the poverty issue, and it applies more to Mount Pleasant than it does to the national level. But essentially what it is back about 100 years ago, before we had the large industrial revolution, technological revolution, that happened around the 80s, 70s, that kind of stuff, and it really exploded. We had people living in luxury, and I mean this applies definitely farther back even more obviously. But you had those living in luxury, and then you had the average civilian. You had the lower class, and you still had the mid class. But the biggest difference wasn't from the low class to the mid class, it was the mid class to the high class. But that line has been deteriorating because of the Industrial Revolution and because of technological revolutions. Things like this tablet device here. They're making things easier to obtain what we considered luxury living back in the day. The definition has slightly changed, but it's kind of like this. If you had a canyon and there was some gold or unfathomable wanted thing on the other end and you were standing across from it, there's a pretty good chance that you're not going to try and jump across a canyon to get whatever that is. It's just, you're going to look at that and be like, well, that's stupid. However, if you shrink that and make it somewhat of a river-sized gap, you find that you're more tempted to want to jump the gap because it seems feasible, but it's still not necessarily feasible for everybody because it depends on your abilities. That was quite the analogy. But what I'm trying to say is in a very similar fashion, you find that what is luxury is more affordable, more obtainable, and easier to get at. But that's a problem because more people are trying to when they can't. You find too many people trying to obtain luxury or, I guess, a living standard that isn't theirs when it's not really feasible, which is how you end up with this budgeting issue that touches on budgeting management and how we can't spend accordingly to our budget income. And if you don't have income, then you're really not spending accordingly and you're going out and buying iPads. So, in the end, I found out that the solution really was not a quick fix. It was quite a tedious, endeavoring process because it involves one-on-one individualism with people that live in poverty. You have to spend time with people in order to explain what it means to change your living conditions. You can't just hand them a wad of cash and make their life better. If you want to solve something, you have to attack a problem at the root, which is why I'm not really a fan of just handing people money that are in need of things. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but it's not going to solve the problem. It's postponing an issue. It's kind of this masking thing that we run into, and it happens with a lot of issues in the United States, but I guess I won't touch on that. But it's more of a one-on-one thing. It's something that you have to show people. It's not something that you can do in a mass quantity. But unfortunately, if that's not the way it's done, which, if we're not willing to do that, then it's just not